sex and gender. My honest feeling is it feels like part of the sort of psychosis of our time. Why do you find this transgender conversation to be so broken and so confusing?
The language that we use in the book is gender is the software of sex. Sex is hardware, gender is software. If we think about some of those reef fish that the trans rights activists are so fond of invoking, that are actually hermaphroditic, right? That do change from one sex to another depending on what species you're talking about. Some of them start out as males and turn into females at a certain point in their development, and some go the other direction. How do we know that they turn from males into females? Well, the indication of sex is what gametes they produce. Males across all animals and plants produce small motile gametes. In animals, we call that sperm. In plants, we call it pollen. If you produce pollen, you're a male. If you produce sperm, you're a male. Females produce small, large, relatively immobile gametes that have all of the other instructions in the cell that allow the thing to go on. So sperm or pollen just has the DNA and a motor if you're sperm, right? That's it. And eggs have an equal complement of DNA plus all of the other machinery of the cell. And so there's lots of good reasons, theoretical reasons, for sex to have become, in all animals and plants on the planet, a binary thing, male and female. Okay, well, what happens once you have male and female that's downstream of that? The software. It's easiest to think in terms of behavior, but all the physiological stuff too. Primary sex characteristics, secondary sex characteristics, that's all downstream of what sex you are, but isn't fundamental to what sex you are. When people talk about gender, which in other species in biology we call sex role, it's generally the behavior. So how do you behave if you are male? If you're one of these reef fish that is hermaphroditic, when you are male, that is when you are in the business of producing sperm, you also behave in a territorial and harem-defending manner. And at the point that you have transitioned into being a female, an actual female, because we can tell by virtue of the fact that you are now producing a different kind of gamete, you're now producing eggs, you behave in a different way as well. And you are, willing to be corralled in this case, the particular case of these reef fish, and to interact with other females in a way that you would not have interacted with as males. In reef fish, sex role, gender, is really highly conscribed and prescribed. Like males don't act like females and females don't act like males. Males can become females, that's what sequential hermaphroditism means, but when males, they don't act like females. So we as mammals aren't hermaphroditic. We can't be hermaphroditic. We have a form of determination by which we become what sex we are that is genetic. We know this, right? XX is female, XY is male. There are some exceptions. They are largely non-viable. So we are not sequential hermaphrodites. We can't become male if we started out female or vice versa. But the gender part of the operation, the sex role, if we were talking about other species, is way more fluid. Just like we have childhoods that go on forever because we're learning what to be, so too is how we can be as individuals who happen to be male or female, be widely variable. Some cultures prescribe how we behave as men or women very tightly. Here in the weird world, not so much. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, a tomboy who was also busy playing classical piano 2 hours a day. I was allowed to do boy-typical things and girl-typical things, and none of that had any effect on whether or not I was or was not a girl. I was. As I have written, what do girls do? Girls become women. Some girls play in the dirt, some girls dream, have tea parties, girls do a lot of other things, but what do all girls do? If they grow up, they become women. Are there some cases in which the developmental environment is so confused or confusing that people really feel that they need to be living in the body of the sex that they are not? That does seem to happen sometimes. Are they actually able to change sex? No. No, they are not. And given that we are humans living in a weird world, why do you need to start calling yourself the sex that you are not or pretend that you are the sex that you are not? Because increasingly, starting around in the 70s or maybe even earlier than that, everything was open.
David Bowie, no one thought you were a girl.
And, and David Bowie's one of my favorite examples. I loved Bowie. I loved Bowie growing up. He was extraordinary. He was gender bending. And he was also, over in his actual sexuality, he was, bisexual. He was always a man. He never doubted that. No one around him ever doubted that, right? He dressed up flamboyantly and he played with stereotypes and he played with roles. And humans have been doing that forever. We play with role a lot, but it doesn't change our fundamental nature. And the drugs that we saw our students on when we were leading field trips, and so we had to receive health histories from people. So we saw that so many of our students, as I already said, were from like 2003 through 2013-ish, had been or were still on speed for the boys, anti-anxiety and antidepressant meds for the girls. Round about 2013, 2014, the drugs that the kids were on started to change. And now, increasingly, they had been on puberty blockers, and now they were on cross-sex hormones. One set of drugs replaced the other. One kind of crazy narrative replaced another over in psych land or medical land, or I don't even know where it came from. But we saw this happen in the health histories of our students and in the ways that they presented to us. And these were good kids, most of whom just thought, well, I just am sort of poetic and gentle, and my dad tells me that boys hunt, and I'm not that, so I guess I'm a girl.
Bret, how do you think about what this transgender narrative, what the fact that kids will enter school and be asked what their gender identity is and be given a list of options?
There are two main themes from the perspective of our obligations and these kids. One is an abdication of responsibility by almost everyone, right? We have an obligation to protect these kids from nonsense, and we are doing such a terrible job of it. And the other is just an outright betrayal. There is money to be made in many different ways by falsely leading these kids into imagining that they have freedoms that they don't. And frankly, as Heather points out, they don't need them, right? They were liberated to write their own script without changing sex, and leading them to believe that they didn't have that option and that the only way to address this was pharmacologically or surgically. We don't have the language to talk about the profoundly damaging idea that your sex is something that you can choose. That's nonsense. The fact is, male and female are different not because somebody imposed these roles on people. It's because the different size of gametes implies a different obligation to invest in offspring, which changes the entire spectrum of how you should think about your hazards and opportunities.
That's the gametes. The bodies they're in, the same is true. And there are exceptions. There are sexual reverse species. There is polyandry out there where, there's multiple male mates for a single female, but those are the exceptions. The fundamental original inequality in investment in what the sex gametes are, it directly translates into what the basic strategies are, male versus female. I've said elsewhere, but for the fact of my natal family, I think, had I been born 40 years later, there are definitely forces in the universe who would have told me I was trans, 100%. The idea that the things that you are interested in change something more fundamental to what you are is it's both a bastardization of logic and a obviously decohering force at the moment in society. It's rare now to run into young people who are willing to say, absolutely, no, it doesn't matter what I do, I'm definitely the sex that I was born. That's nuts. When we were professors, we had students who identified as and who we identified as trans. I still feel that at least a couple of those people are living the lives that are best for them, given the developmental experiences they had growing up, living as if they were the opposite sex. Some other number of those students were trying on a role. It was experimentation, which is what teenagers do, which is what young humans do across time and space. What wasn't true yet then, but which has accelerated in a way that I never could have predicted, was the widespread not just acceptance, but demand that everyone accept that what is fundamentally true about biology is not true. And it feels like this is one of the very few binaries that exist in biology. Sex is binary. There's not very much in biology that is binary. There's not very much that's actually rule-like, but sex is binary. And all the other things that we're arguing about in the culture wars are a little bit more complicated, actually. There are gray areas. This one, there's not, actually, right? If you're male, you're male, and if you're female, you're female. And yes, you can try to drag me into talking about intersex and into, developmental, disorders of sexual development and all of that, but those are exceptions. And this is binary. And honestly, this is exactly as fundamental as 2 + 2 = 4. This is really basic. And once we give up the things that are that basic, what left are we standing on? Like there's nothing left. So, but then at a personal level, it also feels like this tremendous loss. Who knows what I would have been receiving in school? I was a good student. I questioned things, but I was a good student because it worked for me. So who knows what could have gotten into my head? I would like to believe that even growing up now with that family, I would have ended up being one of the ones who resisted, but I see a lot of good people who are not resisting, who have all of the opportunities and still don't resist. And it makes me very, very worried.
I would also just point out that we didn't know it at the time, but that your example says that we were kind of living at the apex of something important, right? You had the liberty to do whatever you wanted, and you did it, right? You didn't sacrifice the ability to have children, to have a marriage, but you also didn't sacrifice the ability to be successful in a career, in a science, which is traditionally a male realm. Not only that, but you worked in the field, you wielded a machete and wore rubber boots. And the point is, you decided which things you wanted, and there was no bar to you mixing them, and it didn't require surgery or drugs or anything like it. So in some sense, the fact that that period ends with this, frankly, regressive notion that these sex roles are so limiting that you have to escape them with surgery or drugs. It is a tragic way to take the achievement of the liberation that was so real and to squander it on some sort of, at least a preposterous notion about how limited these things are.
Pretending that women and men are the same, which was kind of the version of feminism that was going on in the 90s, was foolish. And pretending that men can become women, or that if you want to go out into the field and work alone, then you must actually be a man and just be confused about what your sex is. Both of these are deranged versions of reality.
It's funny, this turn of phrase, the science is settled, or trust the science. Like, what goes through your minds as lifelong scientists?
Many who speak of the science is settled, follow the science, think of themselves as secular. The science that they are talking about is not actually science, but it is filling a religion-shaped hole. It is doing exactly the thing that these people who claim that they are not religious, what religion would be doing for them if they understood that instead of believing in a God, they are believing in a thing called science. And given the way they're describing it, they don't know what science is. It is, it's far more frail and dangerous than any religion really would be, because it's a fiction that the people who actually are doing real science can point at and say, but that's not the thing. You don't understand the thing. You've exalted something to the level of authority, unquestioning authority, that patently doesn't exist and actually there is not even any scripture here. There are no texts that we can refer to with regard to the science being settled that are reliable in the way that, even the 10 Commandments may be outdated, but they still hold truths.
As biologists, as people that study evolution, how do you understand the justification for the equal dignity of every human being.
The Catholic rituals that you're exploring with your son on a weekly basis now point to, what must be the shared etymology of rites of passage and ritual. And this is absolutely one of the benefits of religion. And when humans have tried to create that kind of community with enforcement of rites and rituals in the same way, absent religion, they normally fail. And so there is utility, whether or not the utility emerges from something that is actually manifestly real in the universe. There's utility in having the authority implied that says, actually, it's time to do this. You must do this. And then with regard to the Mandelbrot set and the variation and the truth and the beauty that emerge, the words that come to mind are Darwin's in the end of On the Origin of Species, in which he talks about endless form is most beautiful. So there's convergence of truth and beauty and reality in these different approaches to understanding the world.
Well, interestingly, I'm not even sure it's an analogy, because Mandelbrot was motivated to innovate fractal math because of its inadequacy for fundamentally biological questions. And so anyway, it's there very directly. With respect to your question, I think I don't really want to answer it well, because I like the idea of this fundamental dignity that doesn't require an explanation, but I think there is one, and it's more or less an analogy for when we say that a colorblind society is desirable, right? We don't mean actually unable to see color, but we mean that it's not supposed to matter with respect to your rights and obligations. And this is the same. A psychopath doesn't have equal dignity as far as I'm concerned. They have lost it, but they were entitled to it before they became what they were. I do want to wrap up, though, by pointing out that in our book, we describe that human beings, in order to get from one niche to the other, have a dual mode, that we go from a cultural mode when our ancestors knew well how to exploit a habitat and how to be, into a conscious mode when we're in an environment we don't understand. And so my point about we have to embrace some of what we've been while being open to innovating something that we haven't yet been is an invitation. And the tool that we describe involves a distinction between the sacred, things that are so fundamental that you dare not mess with them at all, and what we call the shamanistic. And the shamanistic is the experimental side of something that is tied to the same structure. So the way religions modernize themselves is that they have this shamanistic side that innovates and discovers what has to be added to the religion to update it for the new realities. You could make the argument that Christianity itself is a shamanistic update to Judaism. So where are we? I think we are in the moment where we cannot embrace the orthodoxy so absolutely that we abandon the obligation to figure out how to modernize these traditions. We need the shamanistic element. It is that moment, and if we don't do that part, we may save ourselves in the short term, but do ourselves in the long term.
Bret, Heather, thank you for being on Dad Saves America. This has been a pleasure and a privilege.
Thank you so much.
Everything that was referenced in this video, you can check the description for the links to all of these items. Thank you so much for subscribing and following if you want to see more.